Hello, Dr. Zach
A
Bush.
pleasure to be with you, Mark.
Welcome.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with the audience. You guys are all contributing to this creation here. I always feel that with every conversation. The listeners of the future are already pulling the truth out of us here. So whatever comes through, we congratulate all of you for manifesting that.
Totally. And every time I hear you speak, it's so inspiring. And I thought I'd give you a quick little intro here,
All right.
just
Keep it short.
in case anybody doesn't know who Dr. Zach Bush is. He's a triple board certified physician specializing in internal medicine, endocrinology, and hospice care. You have a focus in the microbiome and food systems and how it contributes to disease. And we've collaborated on two animations, one of which went really viral, got millions of views. That was on glyphosate and how chemical farming affects our health. And I still get emails all the time about that video. So I thought that would be a really good segue into our first discussion topic is, are people in the modern world unhealthier than people were in the past? Like, are we getting sicker?
Very good. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you look back, it's a couple hundred years, you can track different forms of environmental stressors that were shortening lifespans. A lot of people love to point to the end of the 1800s, the late 19th century there as an example of how good we did in the 20th century at living longer, because the average age in that late 1800s in the United States was around 48 years old or something like this. So that improved to about 78 by the end of the 20th century. So a lot of people point to that as like a great success. But if you look at what was contributing to those average ages, you realize that a lot of it was around neonatal death that was giving that longer thing. And then the second thing was an enormous amount of environmental injury and trauma around manufacturing, mining, intense, industrial systems. And so it was improvement in water systems as well was another major contributor to that. So cholera, tuberculosis, some of these kind of innate traumas that were happening to the immune system due to overcrowding in towns and poor municipal infrastructure. And so really what happened between the late 1800s in most industrial cities, you could look at London or New York or anywhere else in the industrial world at that point, the quality of life and the length of life improved due to neonatal care and cleanup of these intensely overcrowded environments. The latter part of that century then saw a declining amount of health due to the chronic disease epidemics that came in, but it really didn't offset those life expectancies until early in this century. So early in the 21st century, we started to see these predictions that the children being born in the year 2000 were going to live shorter than their parents for the first time in a couple hundred years. So the life expectancy was suddenly declining. And unfortunately, we've seen massive accelerations in this unexpected death of younger people in the last few years. And so some of the term life insurance companies were raising massive alarms by third quarter of 2021 22 that we were seeing 40x increases in death claims in term life insurance in individuals 25 to 55 years old. So this was really this was the healthiest group of population. So what started in the early 2000s as this kind of decline in health of the young productive kind of 25 to 55 year olds really snowballed in this decade. And so we are seeing a real collapse of life, these increased death claims in these young ages. And we were seeing that increase in chronic disease, challenging the productivity and wellness of the population before they die. And then that's coupled, of course, with the infertility rates. And so we see infertility collapsing across pretty much the whole world now. Africa is the only continent that's had a positive trend in sperm counts over the last 30 or 40 years. And even that's starting to plateau and come back down. So really every continent is experiencing a rate of collapse of infertility. So chronic disease, decreased productivity, increased mortality in our 25 to 55-year-olds, and this collapse of fertility with 1 in 3 males now infertile by sperm count. It's kind of painting a pretty grim picture of where we are at as a snapshot of time here.
Yeah, wow. the fertility crisis is something that I've been particularly focused on. I've done quite a bit of work with Dr. Shauna Swan, and
Oh yeah, great book.
we actually just won an
Yeah,
Emmy for our work on a documentary
yeah,
called
it's
"We Are All
awesome.
Plastic People Now." And even in Africa, the birth rate is plummeting faster than in Western countries because they started much higher, and so it's a global thing.
Yeah, that birth rate's tricky as well, and we saw this in China and other places where the birth rate decreases not just because of disease, but because of economic factors, right? And so, if you educate women, the household falls from about an average of 6.4 to 2.4 children or something like that. So, you see this radical decrease just by giving women access to a professional pathway that takes them out of just the domestic quality or domestic definition of their path. Opening up those other channels decreases family sizes. And so in some ways that's probably, in an ideal world, maximum opportunities for every single human on the planet in a sovereign natural law system would probably regulate us at a very stable rate of population. We would not be at risk of overpopulation. We'd keep this kind of 2.4 um, children per household just by learning systems being, you know, I would say, judiciously used, or I guess, democratically used, and if you use that word, but the normalization of education would bring us into this 2.4 children per household. What we see overlapping that, though, is this collapse of biology that's now taking us below the two children per household. As soon as you go below, I think it's 2.1 children per household on average. As soon as you dip below that average, you start to see population shrinkage, and so you're seeing those pressures. And your documentary there with the Emmy Award, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
That Emmy Award is recognizing the challenge of microplastics. I'm assuming in the endocrine systems of peoples around the world. So it's challenging to kind of sometimes denote out as this economic pressures or biologic pressures that are leading to these decreases in household sizes and all of that. But I think it's clear that we now have both in every continent.
Yeah, and there's an idea that we're just getting much better at diagnosing
Mm.
sickness today. Is that at all true? We're just getting better at
I
diagnosing.
mean, there's certainly that contributes to a lot of different trends out there. You can look at something like gluten sensitivity, and there was an awareness in our ability to test for gluten sensitivity in 1992, 1993. The syndrome really reared its head in 1991 when we started spraying glyphosate on wheat globally. And every year since 1991, there's been a steady increase in the number of acres of wheat, legumes, and other grains that are sprayed with glyphosate right at the end of their life cycle to accelerate drying. So it's used as a desiccant, and in that drying agent leaves very high residues of glyphosate in the finished food because it's sprayed right before consumption. And so with that, we saw this advent of leaky gut and this syndrome of chronic inflammation due to exposure to these grains and legumes that were being sprayed with glyphosate. So it's really not gluten sensitivity, it's really glyphosate poisoning that's leading to this syndrome. But even by 1996, 98, when the science was starting to be pretty well understood, very few doctors were diagnosing it in clinic because they weren't utilizing the tools. But by today, it's becoming kind of a normal test that's run in almost every primary care doctor's office. So there's definitely a diagnostic bias that can come into the prevalence of disease as we start to track it. And so I think it's more challenging to get an accurate assessment of where was the environmental stressor that goes up when you're looking at some of these conditions, such as a vague syndrome of headache, gut bloating, things like that would be the constellation around gluten sensitivity. Whereas it's much easier to track hard outcomes on things like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, things that are going to end up on a death certificate. And so that's where we can really accurately track, cancers and neurologic, degenerative disorders much easier than we do these kind of soft syndromes of symptom management that can be subject to diagnostic bias. And so the prevalence is much easier to track if it's going to end up being on a death certificate. Nobody's got gluten sensitivity as cause of death, even though that might be an accurate case in some situations. It's those causes of death that are the easiest way to track environmental insults that are really driving the increase in prevalence of disease.
I'm wondering, do we have any studies or evidence where we can kind of take a bird's eye view and look at countries where they don't spray these chemicals and then versus countries where they do? And do we see like a big difference?
Yeah, you can actually track it per country with a lot of these conditions, things like lymphomas, leukemias, bladder cancer, liver cancer. You can simply track the amount of, you can predict the number of cancer rates, for example, by the number of acres sprayed with glyphosate. So it's a very tight correlation between those exposures. But uniquely, you can also find pockets within single countries that are less exposed to these chemicals and have radically lower rates of disease. Recent study demonstrated that the Amish populations in Pennsylvania, Ohio, in the United States had 0 cases of childhood cancer and 0 cases of autism. And here they are living, within miles of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, where you see these extremely high rates of these conditions. And so, it's remarkable that not just at the nation state level can you track these correlations. At the community level, you can track these correlations of exposure to these chemicals and whatnot. So the technology in general, the Amish is a good example of a group that have largely rejected the technological influences and shifts in the social dynamics within the home, and you see just less toxicity. So there's less plastic, like you've revealed. There's less herbicide, pesticide exposure potentially, although they often are using some of those chemicals now. It's crept into a lot of different farming practices, even in these some of these communities. But needless to say, we can track those environmental injuries all the way down to the community level, not just at the nation state level, as to just how well these toxins track with disease prevalence.
I think in our video, we even used a map showing cancers in America. And in the deep south, like at the base of the Mississippi, where all these these pesticides kind of like spill out, that's where the highest rates of cancer is, like right around the mouth of that Mississippi. And I've spent a little bit of time down in Louisiana, and it's the food there. It's hard to find the
Yeah.
fresher, healthier food.
Yeah, and actually, we shot our documentary that tells that tale. Farmers Footprint is the nonprofit, and we shot that documentary in 2018, and that took us on basically a 2,000-mile drive to shoot those on farms all the way down. But we started at the headwaters of the Mississippi River up in Minnesota and ended in New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi there. And what we saw is you've got basically boarded up communities all the way. It's ghost towns for 1,500 miles through those corridors there, and they're boarded up to the point where there's no retail, there's no restaurants, the bars have recently closed. And while we were doing that trip in 2018, the U.S. Postal Service was closing their post offices in these communities. So you've got 1,500 miles of America, right in the heartland of our country that is now ghost towned out, and there's no resources there, and people are driving 45 minutes just to get gas, let alone 2.5 3 hours to get groceries. And the grocery stores that they have available to them are largely simply processed foods, very little access to produce. Kansas is a potent example of this. Kansas is our most agriculturally prominent economy in the country. So 95%, I think it is 92, 95% of the land in Kansas is used for agricultural production. But Kansas has to import 95% of its food, and 1 in 5 children in Kansas are going to sleep hungry every night. And so they're undernourished in Kansas. So you have the most agricultural, productivity of any state in the country from a landmass situation or per acre kind of contribution, and yet they're starving because they're not growing food. They're growing agronomic commodities rather than food. And so their corn, soybean, and wheat is largely going to non-food products. And the issue is with this GMO crop, largely inedible. A GMO corn cob is not something that you're gonna like buy at the grocery stand and eat there. GMO corn is largely tastes terrible. It's got way too much fibrous material in it, and so you're losing the edible nature of chewing it off the cob. And so all of that corn has to be turned into something other than corn on your plate. And so it's going into the whole gamut of ethanol for your gas tank, plastics for your commodities, CPG packaging, plastic film for wrapping everything in. You've got a lot of it going into animal feed after initial processing, both pet food and large scale uh, systems for your cattle, swine, poultry. And so it's this utter loss of productivity of actual food in our most agronomic states is leaving them in these massive food deserts. And farmers are so stressed that it was extremely rare for us to find a farm. We drive thousands of kilometers before we found a farm that actually had a big, garden out front or on the side of it that was feeding their family and maybe even having a market garden. So nobody's growing tomatoes and onions and basil and all that in their gardens anymore. They're so busy, just trying to pay their bank notes and their bank loans every season with their, scraping away tinier and tinier returns or revenues per acre as the commodities market continues to squeeze them down. And so they're too stressed and too exhausted by the end of a 16, 18-hour day driving tractors around on their land to grow a little bit of food for themselves. So we've totally lost the food sovereignty that this country had in the 1940s. In the 1940s, United States and other allied countries were growing 45% of their food in their backyard gardens in the program that was called the Victory Gardens. And so with the collapse of large scale farming due to the Dust Bowl and pressures of economic supply chains out to the military, it was a huge demand on households to produce their own food, and they did it. And so they started growing all that food for themselves. Today, we grow less than 0.1% of our food in our backyard gardens in the United States. And so we've gone from 40%, 45% on down to 0.1% of productivity. And this is visible on farms as much as it is in urban environments. So this is the push. We got to reinvent this country and doing a lot of work in Africa as well right now. We have to reinvent food systems from the ground up, from the household on up. And food sovereignty is really the only foundation we can reset for global markets and global economies that have created so much vulnerability and poverty worldwide. The amount of true poverty on the planet has never been seen before. This is households that cannot have access to clean water or enough nutrients in a day to maintain health. That's collapsed in Kansas. It's collapsed in rural Africa, world over. And so we really have to, create a new version of the Victory Garden concept where every household is encouraged and incentivized and trained to participate in the food system again. And one of our exciting projects we had going in Africa is something called the 10 Trees program, where we started in the most impoverished, most vulnerable, communities that have been displaced largely in the name of conservation, unfortunately. But South Africa and UNESCO get together and build these huge biosphere national parks, push all the indigenous peoples off of these lands and push them onto undeveloped pseudo semi urban infrastructure with poor plumbing, no water infrastructure, no waste management. And so you end up in these really intense slum like environments with no infrastructure and extremely vulnerable peoples. And we just started there, and 10 trees, vines, and perennial plants in the backyard is guaranteeing that within 5 years this community becomes food sufficient with widespread participation in the program. And over the next 7 generations, nobody can go hungry because every yard is producing enough food to stem that tide of famine. So we have to start down at that granular level. Backyard gardens in Kansas, backyard gardens in Africa. We've got to start back at this understanding of food sovereignty at the individual level, and then start planning bioregional economic contributions. If we start building bioregional economies out of ecological resources that are relevant to that place, you simply reduce this vulnerability, not just food sovereignty, but economic sovereignty, where you start creating, skilled and high skilled jobs, but market niche within every backyard as possible as we start to reduce our dependence on external, centralized systems. We start to realize, wow, we actually have the technological capacity to not only do food locally, we can do energy locally, we can do building materials locally. And if you can build homes, produce energy for those homes, and produce enough food and clean water for those homes to be had within every community, you've leveled the playing field for global economies, global society, global social expression, cultural development. And so that's currently what my main passion is, helping the world recognize the possibility now of bioregional economics that's founded in regional ecosystems, and it's an exciting mission. It's an exciting possibility that we wean ourselves off of central banks and central oil systems and everything else, because we have the know-how now on the planet on how to do these systems in a distributed, multidisciplinary fashion.
Wow, that's incredibly valuable work, and I'm super grateful for what you're doing. And I'm wondering, if I was to start a small garden on half an acre or something, what are the essential crops that you should plant?
It's going to depend on your bioregion. So this is what I get really passionate about. There's no one size fits all. And I think that's been one of the really severely limiting factors in this regenerative movement, is there's been a tendency for us to tell really reductionist stories about the future of food. And we tend to have, a white American farmer standing in, 5,000 acres explaining that they're now doing cover crops and have stopped tilling, and maybe they're doing some high intensity grazing patterns, and now they're carbon positive and they're trying to get carbon credits and all this for their soil, but they're still not growing food. They might be growing some meat through selling their cattle or something like that, but they haven't really broken out of the commodities definition of farming that we're stuck in. And the true regenerative revolution is going to take hold when we exit the commodities market and start doing direct to consumer sales. And so a lot of regenerative organic farms still have 3,000 kilometer supply chains, and so they're still sending their products to large CPG companies or whatever it is. And so, you can look as far as South America and Africa for examples of this, but you don't have to go any further than Kansas to see the results. You're growing 90% of your land is committed to growing stuff, and you can't feed yourself. So the commodities market is inevitably going to strip resources out of local ecologies and return very little money back to those local economies because of the centralized, mechanisms of society that we've put together. The coasts of the United States are sucking the energy out of the middle of our country. Literally, the energetics of soil, the nutrients, the energetics of the humans that are in slave labor basically to these systems. The only place that you see the benefit of all of those efforts is in the high dollar marketplace of Erewhon, or some Whole Foods somewhere on a coastal city that has an extractive enough economy to be able to afford these high dollar prices. And so it's a fundamentally flawed system that we have across the board now when it comes back to the food. To put a price point on it, in the 1960s, before we really moved into the large scale commodities marketplaces that we currently farm in, the farmer was making about 60 cents on the dollar for every dollar spent by the consumer on food. Today, that farmer is making about 13 cents on the dollar. And so that loss of, the 47 cents or whatnot, it has made it impossible to stay in business for so many farmers. Today, we're losing 6,000 family farms a year on average in the United States, because there's no economic, returns that are encouraging those next generations to stay on the farm. And so for 2 generations, really for 3 generations, as soon as World War II finished up, farmers started telling their kids, you know what, do the GI Bill, go to the city, get a high skilled labor job in computers or whatever the heck you can find. Don't do farming. So for 3 generations, we have not been encouraging. We haven't had an economic, reward system that that's there for these next generations. And for that, kids have been being pushed off the farm. And now the average farmer in the United States, depending on what you look at, some people say they averaged around 51 years or something like that of age. But a lot of people are saying that that number is actually a lot closer to 68 or 70 years of age now for the average American farmer. And so there's this crisis of succession due to this loss of economic, you know, incentive for these younger generations to get involved. And of course, you got consolidation going through there. Average family farm, 1960s, you're at a couple hundred acres. Now you're at a few thousand acres of land to be able to survive because the revenue per acre just keeps going down and down and down. So you have to have economies of scale to survive. So that's, again, pointing to this reality of like, okay, we're now in the fundamental collapse. We need a new system to emerge. A new system will emerge. I think that's one thing. Like for everybody listening, like how are we possibly going to recreate a $1.8 trillion food system in the United States? And the answer is, oh, it will happen. It's not an option. It's not like a possibility. This will absolutely happen because these centralized systems are going to continue to fundamentally collapse. And so it's inevitable now that change is coming. We can see the beginnings of it, but unfortunately, we're going to have a pretty deep humanitarian crisis because we're not good at changing complex systems until they utterly fail. We spend so much of our time palliating and creating band-aids and past jobs for broken systems. And that's what we're doing as a nation now. This quantitative easing where we suddenly print $4 trillion out of the ethers. We're doing that to maintain our debt, debt management. So just to pay our the interest on our debt as a country, we're having to do these extreme measures. So this is not a viable economy. The whole system's collapsing. That's why you see the U.S. reserve dollar kind of starting to lose favor globally. You see a lot of countries exiting the U.S. dollar as their reserve currency. And so this is the death toll of not just a farming industry, but really a hegemony or a U.S. empire that was an economic empire rather than military empire, perhaps. But the only thing giving our U.S. dollar any worth over the last 30, 40 years has been our military. So we're locked into this necessity for war and this necessity for abstract economic easing or economic band-aids because we haven't yet decided that we're going to do the other thing. So for that, each person deciding they're going to plant that backyard garden, that's the beginning of the revolution. The complex systems will not lead the change now. The complex systems will continue to do more and more abstract and more devastating destruction in their effort to buoy up a ship that's long been sinking. So we have at the individual household level the opportunity to start to rebuild that system by looking at what radical independence and radical sovereignty looks like at the level of food, energy, transportation, education. And you can see this happening during the pandemic. We saw seed supplies sell out of every single outlet in the world as people suddenly realized, whoa, grocery stores actually can run out of food. There can be empty shelves on it's been generations since we had seen that. We had forgotten that we had no idea we were so vulnerable. So the pandemic really kind of, I think, unmasked the crisis we're in a lot of ways, and we saw people flocking to our garden program at Farmers Footprint, for example. Like we have a simple couple month long training for people who have never grown a garden. How do you go from seed to plants to real significant productivity even in pots or on your patio, let alone in a backyard that used to be Kentucky bluegrass. You can turn that into a food forest in just a matter of months. And so those programs have been really catching traction. So if you're listening and thinking, yeah, I definitely want to get in on this, very easy access, farmersfootprint.us is the website there, and start getting trained up. Farmer Greg has been doing really successful urban gardening at scale in small plots. And so not just providing for the own home, but in a normal backyard that you would have in the United States, you can actually supply enough for 40 households to start to have access to healthy, nutrient-dense food. So it doesn't take much to really start getting scale in at the community level. And I get excited about that. I get excited that we're going to be forced now to do the right thing for ourselves and for the planet by decentralizing systems.
That's really inspiring. And Yeah, I have this like calling to get out into a garden and plant everything. You reminded me of a book by Michael Pollan. I believe it's called The Omnivore's Dilemma.
Yep.
And I'm not sure if this is the book. He's written a lot of books about food, but he talks about how corn was the most economically incentivized crop to grow because for the amount of space it takes up, you can get the most weight for corn. So, because of those incentives, all the farmers went to growing corn. And then we had this massive surplus of corn that we didn't know what to do with. So, he talked about how this translates to the grocery store, where when you walk into a grocery store, it's set up in a way to like appeal to your psychology. Like the first thing you see is a huge diversity of like flowers and oranges and apples, and it looks like they've got food products from all over the world right when you walk in, and you kind of feel good about yourself. You put some broccoli and an apple in, you're like, yeah, I'm doing good. But the deeper you get into the grocery store, the more all the products just become one thing. They're all from corn or soy. So like you turn around the corner and all the cereals are just different forms of corn. All the chips and all the processed food is some form of corn just with a different texture profile. And yeah, it makes you think like as you go deeper into the grocery store, your willpower lowers, and by the end you're just grabbing impulsive things. You're grabbing ho-hos and Twinkies at the register. And it makes me think of how you can have morbidly obese people, but they're extremely malnourished. I've been seeing a couple articles on that recently. How did we strip all the nutrition out of food?
Yeah, we did that by destroying soil microbiology through the wide scale use of herbicides and pesticides. So our laboratory is expert in glyphosate, which is the number one herbicide used worldwide, but it's really sits among a whole cadre of incredible toxins that are now sprayed on our soil systems. So 2,4-D is now used very broadly through the United States and other growing systems. 2,4-D is Agent Orange. It's just the racemic or the mirror image of the molecule, but Agent Orange was obviously just used to destroy the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam over the course of the Vietnam War. And so, over a 25-year period, we turned one of the most verdant jungles in the world into a literal moonscape. Gray dust, a foot or two deep, wiped out every single tree, plant, vine, tree frog, insect, like just turned it into a moonscape with this chemical Agent Orange. And now we're treating all of the soil systems of the world with 2,4-D and glyphosate. Glyphosate's in the same organophosphate family as Agent Orange as well. So 1973, Vietnam right wraps up. By 1974, they're repurposing organophosphates into food, and initial patents on Roundup are put in 1974. By 1976, Roundup is in large scale use across the United States and other markets because it was so effective at killing anything green. And so it was used as a very effective herbicide, but you couldn't get the concentration very high because it would kill your corn, soybean, and everything else because it kills anything green until 1992, 93 starts to roll around and they start to be able to genetically modify the plants to be able to tolerate glyphosate. And so they started GMO, Roundup ready crops with squash, I think in 1993, corn, soybeans, 1996, and now we've got over 30 crops that are genetically modified to be able to handle direct spraying of Roundup, which is the active ingredient of glyphosate. And so this has been this march towards you know convenience at the farmer level to be able to manage 10,000 acres with two people, which is actually normal. Like it's normal to find one or two farmers managing thousands of acres. Those farmers have never put a shovel in their land because there's not time to go walk on their land or put a shovel in to check on their microbiology or check how many earthworms are left. So they're just driving tractors around all the time, plowing, disking, spraying, whatever's needed. And so they're back and forth across this land in heavy equipment all the time. And they're largely unaware of just the devastation of microbial and nutrient density within their own soils. And it always surprises them when you go out in the field and dig a 12 by 12 by 12-inch hole and find out that there's zero earthworms. It only takes a single spraying of glyphosate in a field to wipe out 100% of the top dwelling earthworms and 50% of the entire deep dwelling population. You do that now 2 or 3 times a year for 30 years, you've annihilated your earthworms. In that process, you also wiped out all the little microbes, the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. This is the life that makes soil happen. soil that's happening, meaning lots of microbial diversity that's then feeding a mycelial network of the fungi that's then creating this incredible relationship to plant roots in which something called the mycorrhizae are produced. And the mycorrhizae is kind of that spider webby looking stuff that you see in a pot if you repot a plant at home or something like that. Those little spider webs are these little tubules that are produced by in cooperation between the mycelium and the root systems of a plant. And so they're now transiting all of this information and nutrients from the soil up into the plant. With herbicide chronic usage, you lose the bacteria that would feed the fungi, you lose the fungi, the mycelial network, you lose the mycorrhizae, and now you've got plants that are growing with a very difficult time extracting nutrients. So to overcome that, the farmer has to put in more and more chemical inputs to try to overcome this barrier of bioavailability of nutrients. And so they're spraying more and more nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium to try to force these macronutrients into the plants. But what they're not doing is replacing all the micronutrients. And so you might have a green corn plant, but you have no manganese in there, you have no selenium, you have none of the trace nutrients that are necessary for biology to happen on the other side of the consumption of that plant. And so we're going to this vast, nutrient deficiency in both macro and micronutrients as we destroy the microbial systems of the soil and therefore start growing deficient plants. That's part of the issue. The second part of the issue that's leading to this obesity epidemic that I'm very frustrated at my industry in medicine that we have done such a poor job understanding the obesity epidemic. I'm appalled at my own education. Like I was not trained to understand why the world suddenly got obese. It's always blamed on sugar. Like, oh, we just, eat too much sugar. Sugar was our main caloric intake, as far back as the 1920s. Like we have always loved sugar. We've always, the sugar industry was massive in the late 1800s. We had slave labor being, moved out of India to fuel the British and Dutch sugarcane fields in South Africa. That's 150 years ago. So sugar has been a problem forever. We didn't develop this obesity epidemic until suddenly in the early 80s. And what happened in those few years is that those herbicides started going up in concentration within our food and water systems. And the most sensitive microbes to these herbicides that function as antibiotics, I didn't maybe mention that, but glyphosate kills weeds, but it kills the bacteria and fungi in the soil systems directly. And so it functions as potent antibiotic. But the most sensitive bacteria in the body that would respond to these low levels of antibiotics are actually the mitochondria. These are small little bacteria that live inside of our cells that produce the energy from our food, that make it available to the energy available to us. Each human cell has about 200 mitochondria. As you start to poison those mitochondria, the reservoir of life within the cell goes down. And so you accelerate the deterioration of the microbial reservoir with the mitochondrial reservoir within the human body as you start adding glyphosate to food and water systems. If the bacteria in your gut are feeding your body those nutrients, glucose and carbohydrates as well as fatty acids, those are your two fuel sources. Protein is not a fuel. So your sugar and fats are being channeled into your gut lining, into the liver, repackaged, sent out to the body. But if the body is receiving all of that caloric opportunity with sugars and fats, but don't have enough mitochondria to process that down, it simply, each cell stops taking up the nutrients or those potential calories or sending it right back after failing to convert. And you start storing all of those calories in the liver. And so you start getting fatty liver. And so by the 1980s, we were seeing this explosion of fatty liver from nutritional sources because the mitochondrial productivity was declining. We basically had a bottleneck of caloric demand or caloric opportunities, caloric reservoir backing up into the liver. Once the liver is full of fat, you start to develop diabetes. So you get insulin resistance. So by the late 80s, we suddenly see this explosion of prediabetes and diabetes in children and adults and everything else. And so obesity then leads to that phenomenon of diabetes and insulin resistance, which then accelerates cardiovascular disease, cancers, immune dysfunction, go on down the list. So it's really the destruction of microbes at the soil level. With that, we saw the advent of the destruction of mitochondria inside of our cells. And so soil, gut microbiome collapse, and then mitochondrial collapse inside the cells. Those are kind of your three layers of impact of glyphosate and other herbicide pesticide residues within our food system.
Wow, that was brilliantly explained. And I'm wondering, do you have an opinion on Ozempic? It's gotten pretty popular lately, and is this going to be the thing that gets us out of jail?
Yeah, unfortunately, drugifying the complex endocrine system of the human that regulates appetite is basically saying we're going to make it easier for you to run on an empty tank. That's basically what these drugs are doing. And so they're taking away the neurologic stimuli for food intake through a bunch of different mechanisms. Um, it's the opposite of THC and CBD that drives you to eat more, right? And so there's plant compounds that accelerate your food intake by regulating or manipulating appetite, and there's drugs that will reduce that. There's and then there's this whole impetus for breaking the push of nutrients through the liver, and it's such a reductionist, kind of short-sighted approach to human health. Like if we just take nutrients away from the body, then they will be less obese. Uh, it's it's a self-defeating premise, and it's amazing that we turn these into multi-billion-dollar drugs, and neither the doctor or the patient are asking the right questions in these scenarios. And I mean, from my opinion at this point, it's it's one of the deepest ethical dilemmas that the industry has now. Is doctors are no longer trained to be healers. Doctors are trained to be pharmaceutical technicians, and we are brainwashed out of asking these root cause questions, or these taking a look at the forest. We're just not encouraged to do it at all. In fact, we're disincentivized. We're threatened. We're not doing standard of care, then your license is going to be taken away or whatnot. And so the standard of care is these following drugs. And if you're not prescribing a statin and a blood pressure medicine and one of these obesity drugs to your patients, you're not following standard of care, and so you could be subject to legal consequences. You could be sued by your patients. You could be sued by industry. You could be sued by And so it's these vague, veiled threats of non-compliance with the pharmaceutical standard of care that has us, disincentivized from even, popping our head above, the earth to take a look around and see what we've created here together. And I was so guilty of this. And by 2010, I was a master technician of drugs. I was creating chemotherapy. I was literally in the laboratory every day, creating better and better versions of poisons for human cells. And getting paid to do that was my job, was to find poisons to give to humans. And so and it seemed reasonable. A relatively intelligent person, never like at the top of my class or anything like that, but relatively intelligent person, and I felt like I had a pretty big heart for my patients, and I just assumed I was doing the right thing. Because, certainly a $5 trillion U.S. healthcare system wouldn't be doing the wrong thing, would it? It's like it just seemed obvious. Like here I am in marbled halls of one of the best university hospitals in the world. We must be doing the right thing. Like we're the experts. We're that. So it's this frog in boiling water kind of phenomenon with our education system, and this sub specialization of the doctor, where I couldn't see the forest for the trees, but my patients could, and it ended up being my patients that radically changed my career direction by asking some of these intensely difficult questions. And I'd been a doctor for 8 or 10 years by that time, and so you start to really gain respect for the people that you're with in these clinics, and you're one-on-one with patients that are facing life-threatening conditions every day, and you're in the trenches with them, and you start to really revere the courage of a patient going through multi-year treatment for their metastatic cancer or whatever it is. And the journey is intense. When you're a doctor, you're literally like the finger in the dike of an explosion of disease that's never been seen in human history before. And there's not enough resources, there's not enough time, there's not enough education, there's just not enough of anything to actually make a dent in this literal tsunami of diseased people that are washing over you as a doctor today. And you've got 4.5 minutes per patient. Like you just can't see the forest for the trees. And so a reductionist toolbox of pharmaceuticals that were handed is the only thing you have time to crank through in 4 minutes, What's your complaint? Here's the drug that matches that complaint. Next one. What's your complaint? Here's the drug that matches that complaint. Next one. And so this is the system that we are ultimately trained into. So I want everybody to just maybe send out grace and forgiveness to every doctor you might know or come in contact with, because they did begin in with a really good heart to help humanity and try to curb suffering. And they did work their asses off to get their education. And most of them, like me, I'm half a century in now, and I'm still paying off my school loans from 25 years ago. And so they put us in such massive debt to get these educations, put us in such massive neurologic overload with the demands of on the mental and intellectual levels, and then you put us into a spiritual crisis of not being able to help our patients, and our patients are just dying in more and more depression and suicidality and psychosis along the journey, and it makes us insane. And doctors have the highest suicide rate of any profession out there, aside from farmers. Farmers are the number one, doctors number two in the suicide rates right now. So we set out with good intention, and when we see the results of our intense labor doing the opposite of what we intended, major depression and suicide become a rational outlet. And if anybody really wants to get an intense look at this, I worked with an incredible author, Alex Woodard, to basically write my story, through the lens of farmers, and the doctors are kind of taking the back seat in the book. But it's called Ordinary Soil. It's available on bookshelves around or bookstores around the area where you can grab it on Amazon or whatnot. But Ordinary Soil is an incredible novel told through the eyes of a farm family, and it really gets at this crisis that we're in a deep way. I think you get to see why the suicidality is there in farmers, why the suicidality is there in doctors, and just how desperate we are to be something other than the problem. And when farmers and doctors start to feel like the problem to their own families and their own patients or their own environments or their own farms, the third, fourth generation farmer who's losing the family farm, like there's so much guilt and shame in that, and you just can't even measure it. And so we're on the front lines of biologic collapse as pharmaceutical technicians. Both doctors and farmers are trained by the same chemical industries to use these chemicals that ultimately undermine biology on the planet and within each individual. And so it's a desperate journey right now as we realize that we were trained into the wrong philosophy. And it's scary to switch philosophies. It's frightening, but we're seeing farmers all over the world doing it. We're seeing doctors all over the world starting to realize that it's time for a fundamental change in philosophy, and natural systems as a foundation for our future health, and farming industries is the only way we can go. And farmers and physicians are making that leap now. So there will be a lot of morbidity and mortality and patients and doctors and farmers between now and then. Like you said, the cancer maps that we show with the farming, the highest cancer rates in the whole world are those farmers at the end of the Mississippi River that has now collected 85% of all of the Roundup sprayed in the United States into that one body of water. And the concentrations are just so carcinogenic at that rate, at that location, that you've got, farmers on their fifth case of, fifth type of cancer by the time they're in their 50s. And so it's just it's a holocaust that we're in the midst of, biologically, psychologically, and perhaps spiritually. And the silver lining is humans need this level of collapse to fundamentally change everything, and we are beginning to change everything. And so I do believe that there is a path, maybe a very razor's edge path through the maelstrom that we've created with our divorce from nature. But I believe there is this razor thin path that we could take as a humanity to avoid our own extinction and to recreate, human society. And it's less about doing something or creating that future. It's more about reducing our current codependence or participation in these abstract economies that are driving this destruction. We need real outcomes in our daily basis. So what's happening in your home that ties you directly to soil, water, and air? If you don't know that answer, you need to start looking. How do I directly, in my daily activities, influence soil, water, and air systems? How do I create more food, more clean water, more energy for my home than I used? And there's some exciting examples of this. One of my best friends is in Australia, in Melbourne. His name is Joost Bakker, and he has a documentary that I think is named after his project, but it's Future Food Systems. Future Food Systems is a short documentary on his adventure. He's actually a florist by training and career, but he's such this innovative thinker that he was delivering flowers to hotels and restaurants all over Melbourne and was seeing the amount of food waste that was coming out of the current food system. 45-50% of the food, finally getting to a restaurant is being thrown away in the dumpsters behind. So he was appalled by this, inefficiency. And he's like, man, there's a huge economic opportunity here. If somebody just stops the waste, like you nearly double the revenue for the restaurant. And so he set out to build the first zero waste restaurant in Melbourne, and he successfully did that. It was so successful, he sold it within like 2 years. Started another restaurant that not only was zero waste, but took all of the waste from area restaurants. That company was called Brothel because they were turning all of the waste into different broths and soups and all of this. And that ended up being super successful in selling. And after those successes of those zero waste restaurants, he's still a florist. He's still doing that as his main thing. But he just couldn't help thinking, like, there's so much waste in a single home. So how do I reinvent that? And so he created Future Food Systems on the back of a napkin, drawing a house that could unfold from a shipping container and turn into a 3-story home that grew more food, produced more water, and produced more energy than was used in the home. And the whole thing just was completely self-contained. And he successfully built that. He's just such a revolutionary mind. Like, he's our Nikola Tesla of our age. I feel like he's just brilliant. And I got to walk through the framework before it became a home and was astounded by just the simplicity of his genius. The right thing is always so simple. And the design of this home, it's just a steel fabricated home, pops out into these 3 pieces from a shipping container, erects, and then all of these sustainable products are used to build the system. Products that are made from local farm waste, wheat straw, etc., are the wall panels and building materials. And so it's just an extraordinary demonstration that the building itself can stimulate local, bioregional economies. And then it has these food systems in it that grow mushrooms and, green gardens all up at the walls. The whole roof of the place is covered in greenery. It's got tanks with aquaponics, so you got fish production. You've got methane recapture and gas and energy production from the human waste in the thing. Like, it's just mind blowing that all of this is literally off the shelf. Like, these technologies are readily available, and this florist just decided, why aren't we doing this? And so he did it within a year, and he installed the first facility and just dropped it down on the pavement in Fed Square in Melbourne. And this thing ran for 2.5 years, producing gobs of food and water and energy out of this thing that had no connection to municipal water or food or electrical systems. And so he proved it, hands down. And that project, the documentary is worth watching, but it was featured. I got him hooked up with the Zac Efron show. Now I'm forgetting Zac Efron's name of his program, but
Down to Earth.
Down to Earth, thank you.
Yep.
And so it's, I think, in the 2nd or 3rd season of Down to Earth, you can see Yost's project there and get a glimpse of that. But the documentary will truly blow your mind. Of like, this stuff is readily available. Every household in America could readily repurpose infrastructure and design to do this level of food and water production, energy production, etc.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think there's a very high demand for this type of thing, but a lot of people just don't know where to start, or they, I'm not going to be able to figure out how to grow a garden. I don't have that expertise. I'm busy doing other things. It's hard to wrap your mind around just taking on such a big project. But if somebody could provide it, I'm sure there's a very strong demand for it. One thing that came to mind during that beautiful monologue you just went on is your perspective is so refreshing because you're really humble. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of humility in the medical industry. How has ego impacted healthcare?
That's a good question. That's a funny question. I mean, in some ways, it's the same impact that it's had on human society for the map of the last 5,000 years. It is the wound. This is the wound. You want to, as a doctor, I can tell you that the original wound of humanity is a split mind, and that came out of our belief of abandonment. And so somewhere deep in the human experience, not late. I think it's recent. Like, it's interesting. Like, I spend a lot of time with indigenous cultures all around the world now, and the most ancient of them are the Khoi and the San people of Africa. You know, if you go to any of the indigenous cultures here in North America, you're at about a 40,000 year oral history. Yeah, Aboriginals in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand, 40,000 years. The Khoi and the San, 100,000 year oral history of those societies. And so these are ancient, ancient histories. And they didn't really, see a significant break in that, the trajectory of the sustainability of those until about 5,000 years ago. Somewhere around 5,000, 7,000 years ago, I've traveled all over the place talking to literally, headwaters of the Amazon to Africa to, high, Arctic Rim peoples, like, it's all over the world. And they all have a universal amnesia about 5,000 years ago. Nobody can remember what happened to change the trajectory of things 5, 7,000 years ago. And so I believe something happened to the human biology that then affected our neurologic reality, which is to say our sensory perception of our reality. And some 5,000 years ago, we came to adopt the belief that we had been rejected by nature. You go back to ancient Hebrew scriptures about 4,000 some years ago, and there's this story that humans suddenly got kicked out of the garden. And the very first symptom of that was an awareness of shame and guilt. At that moment of abandonment from nature, we had to develop a shield to protect us from this belief that we were rejected. And so in abandonment, we adopt or create, collectively, we created this thing that we call ego. It's basically a construct, right? It's a abstract concept of, oh, everybody's against me. I need to protect myself. What we didn't realize was that we adopted a construct that didn't just isolate us from one another, it isolated us from ourselves. So the ego is a split in our own mindedness. It splits the masculine and feminine within each of us. It splits the creative and the witness within each of us. The masculine energy within any system is basically that which holds space and witnesses what flows through. And the feminine is the energy that would flow through that system that is held in space and witnessed. When we adopt the ego, we can no longer witness our own beauty. And so we don't just have a sense of abandonment and rejection from nature, we start to abandon and reject our own identity, our own sense of self-worth that would go with that identity. And so the ego is ultimately a construct that stems from the original wound of this rejection from nature, this original abandonment disorder. And the ego then ensures that everything you do in life is going to be trying to palliate this split mindedness. And so we're constantly looking outside of ourselves to complete ourselves. And this is what leads to codependent relationships. And so we have codependent relationships with breathing. Almost every American, everybody in Western society, everybody outside of deep cultural, indigenous heritage is over breathing. We breathe 16 to 20 times a minute. And that's an insane respiratory rate. Like, it's just like sipping air, sipping air, sipping air all day. We should be breathing 4 times to 6 times a minute. And so we're addicted to even breath. But then you get into the food system and it just goes on and on. We're addicted to the way in which we move. We got to spend thousands of dollars for our yoga things, and got to spend thousands of dollars for our gym membership because we're no longer moving in natural systems. And so every time we break our relationship, we develop another codependency with abstract systems. And so from breath to movement to food to community to our concept of play, all of these things are there. And so that's ultimately why I closed my clinic, was I realized I was in codependence with my own patients. If you had to come to my, you had to be sick to come to me, and you were coming to me to complete your wellness, I was part of your addiction. And so we replaced my clinic with something called Journey of Intrinsic Health, which is an 8-week program that now runs online and globally, coaches all over the world. And that program is so exciting to us because it's not a course. It's not like it's a true human experience that happens over these 8 week period where you actually get to experience being human. Most people have absolutely no idea what it feels like to be me. Not just me, but you don't even know what it feels like to be you because you're so busy fulfilling all of these roles in your life, these abstract roles of employee or boss or musician or whatever the eight identities that you're sitting there carrying around. You're so busy trying to fulfill the obligations and responsibilities of those roles, you have absolutely no idea what it feels like to be you. And this is getting loaded on our children at younger and younger ages now. By age 4 or 5, they're already like asking, like, well, how do they get to the Ivy League track of education? Which private schools and all this. Like, children are being forced in these abstract identities at just preschool levels now. And so for this, humans no longer know what it feels like to be human. And so the 8 week journey of intrinsic health begins at, what does it feel like to be you? What is it real? How do you get to that core identity? And so it's a big, intense strip down of reality. And once you know what it feels like to be you, we get to reintroduce you to your environment. What does it feel like to breathe when you're just you? What does it feel like to drink water? So reintroducing your relationship to food, water, breath, movement, community, creativity. That's the 8 week journey. And what we see in the process of that is revolutionary rates of healing in what was thought to be entrenched disease that had maybe existed in these people for 10, 20, 30 years. Those diseases were simply symptoms of the disconnect from self that began at this egoic split from the original abandonment disorder. So as you solve for the root cause of all of our codependencies, you start to do intense healing. And the medical system is an incredible example of an addiction that we developed in this codependent way of, oh my God, I am no longer healthy. My body's out of my control. My obesity, my acne, my autoimmune disease. I need something outside of myself, which is ludicrous because there's no way that health is coming from outside of your body. You self-organized in your mother's womb with no instructions. You knew how to take one cell and turn it into 70 trillion human cells that was populated with 14 quadrillion mitochondria to release sunlight inside of your cells so that you can be a light being walking around in a meat suit. Like this is freaking miraculous stuff. And there's no technology that's come out of human ingenuity that can even hold a candle to even understanding how you self-organized in the womb, let alone improve your biologic function. It's impossible. And so the intrinsic health journey has been so fascinating to find out that everybody has the intelligence within them to go back to the original design, go back to the original math of who are you, how do you function, how does biology emerge from you towards this phenomenon that we might call health.
Wow, that was brilliantly said. And you just reminded me of a conversation I had last week with Daniel Schmachtenberger.
They're always
He,
interesting conversations.
yeah, he described something that overlaps really well to the timeline you just laid out about ego, where he talked about the technologies that we created and how they changed, they conditioned us. So about 10,000 years ago, we started plowing fields.
Mm-hmm.
And the second we started using the plow, we made the buffalo our slave. He said that that destroyed animism, where we saw that every animal, every plant had a spirit in it. And once we did that, once we made the buffalo our slave, we put ourselves above animals, and animals lost their spirits within. And then about 5,000 years ago, we started writing. How did writing change us? It kind of destroyed our perfect memory. We used to have these incredible oral traditions. And once you adopt writing, we don't need to have the conversation with the person. That's not as important, and then you lose context. You lose a whole matrix of things. And flash forward to today, just something like GPS. Now everybody uses GPS to get around.
Nobody knows where
And,
the hell they are.
you know, yeah, I don't know. I need the GPS to get to the grocery store 3 blocks away now. I don't know where I am
Yeah.
anymore. And so each time we create a big invention, we pat ourselves on the back, but we don't realize how it's conditioning us. It's not neutral.
Separating us from our reality. Yeah.
And I guess this leads to a really deep idea of like AI is coming down, and it's really making us question like, okay, if AI can do everything that a human can do, but better and faster, what role does a human even serve anymore?
Yeah.
Why are we here?
That's our opportunity to finally become human beings. We've been so busy doing the human doing thing that we forgot what it feels like to be. And that's week one of the 8 week course, man. If you don't begin again there, then you are obsolete, because nature does nature well. Computers do abstract systems well. Computers don't do nature well. And so what is the future you want to live into? If you want a post-apocalyptic, scene where we become enslaved to our own computers, you're already living that. That we've achieved that sense. Yeah, you are a slave to your Google search engine at this point, and that Google search engine is dictating which products that you're going to consume today. It's going to dictate what the results of your curiosity are commoditized. And I believe that Google was the beginning of the end for us in this relationship of abstract worlds, because for the first time we had commoditized everything by the time 2000 came around. But over the decade of 2000 2010, we had certainly commoditized crops and food, and software had become a commodity that was being gobbled up in all the dot-com boom of the late 1990s and all this. And but we hadn't yet commoditized human curiosity, and that's what Google did. And so when we did that, we fractured our deepest relationship to the divine within us. I believe that the evidence that we are of the universe, that we are actually of something much grander than the physical, protein structures of my body, is the fact that we are curious. I think that curiosity is the evidence of the divine within us. And when we decided to commoditize the divine within us, it was our last straw. That's when we lost all tie back to truth and to a concrete reality. And so when you watch wars and rumors of wars start to dictate our behavior because we believe what we see on a social media feed or a Google search result, we are so easily duped now as to what reality looks like and what truth feels like. We don't even remember. And so it's interesting to speak truth into these environments, and I hear it from a lot of quarters now. There's a lot of brilliant minds around the world that are starting to speak truth, and you've mentioned a few of them on this thing. So, and what you do with your work, Mark, is so interesting to me, in that truth, when told by word, is only so powerful. But when truth is seen, so there's something about your visualization that you create in your work, that it gets this visceral reaction that we can't reach with words. And so it does take us back to these kinds of systems of, cave paintings created vibrations of intelligence, and then the written word and white papers and everything else destroyed our relationship to the energetics of communication. And so you are cutting through that a bit with your work, and the fact that you've figured out simplicity in the visual depiction is starting to require you to tune into a vibration behind the message that you're trying to depict in images. And you're tying into that vibration, and then you're creating so few strokes. You look at the number of strokes on a page that you create versus what an abstract impressionistic artist might use. You're down to so few strokes because you're depicting not so much an information stream rather than a vibrational experience. And so I don't even know if you're doing that, but that's my overall impression of what you're doing, is you have figured out how to distill complex information into a vibrational image, an image that captures the vibration of it. And so the person now watching an after school episode is getting an experience that they haven't had in many generations, but it was what they would have had around the fire, hearing story with drums and other elements of nature, the cicada and the crickets around. There was enough vibrational context of the story that it was always remembered. The Khoi and the San people had a 100,000-year oral tradition of history that was remembered because it was vibrationally contextualized in nature. It was at the fireside with the bugs and the insects and the vibration of the macroflora and fauna and the elephants walking by and everything else. Like, nature was holding the vessel for story to be told and remembered. As we divorce ourselves from nature, we cannot remember a damn thing because the vibrational integrity of the vessel in which we're receiving information is no longer there. And so we are leaky sieves to information now because of the failure of the container. If nature is not our container for our daily activities, we will be a leaky sieve. We will leak nutrients, we will leak breath, we will leak energy, we will leak memories. We're just not coherent because we are not contextualized in the vibration of nature. And so this is, hallmarked now, or poster child of this is our Alzheimer's and Parkinson's dementia syndromes. As you decontextualize human minds from their nature, in their isolation, they fail completely to remember who they are, who their loved ones are, all of this. And so when you look at that in an Alzheimer's patient who's 70, 80 years old, it's a tragedy. But when you realize the same phenomenon is happening in a child who's 3, 4 years old and has so much sensory processing overload that they can't even function, they can't speak, they're so overwhelmed that they hit their head on a wall 6 or 8 hours a day to stimulate enough pain to reduce the overwhelming cacophony of information streaming into their body because they've lost the natural systems container for their neurologic experience as a human being, and we call that autism. It's the isolation of the human being that leads to the failure of understanding, the failure of sensory processing that allows us to have a coherent thought that turns into a coherent sentence that then coherently is told as a story that could coherently be understood, that then could be coherently remembered. All of those layers are broken down now, and we are just churning machines and moving information and new stuff through us every day, and we can't even remember. You set down your phone, you can't even remember the last 40 Instagram posts that you look at. They just start flowing through you because you are a sieve. There's nothing to contain it because you lost your container, because you got disconnected from nature. And this is real, folks. This is like something I actually watch under the microscope. Like, I'm in my headquarters here in Virginia. Right beneath me is our laboratory. My laboratory. I'm so happy about my lab. By the way, this is like me nerding out for a second, but I was like, major researcher in chemotherapy or whatever, or not major. I was a minor player in the world, but minor researcher in chemotherapy and cancer research at the University of Virginia and the marbled halls and all this. My lab is like 10x in its capacities now in this like kind of hippie setting of asking what soil and plants and water can do for you. We've got such a cool laboratory downstairs, and it's doing such radical science right now because we get to ask these root solution questions that you can never ask in academic halls. And I'm just so pleased with our scientists that are down there cranking right now because their joy is increasing on a daily basis because they are witnessing things never imagined before. But I want to get back to this concept that nature is creating the container for the human experience. We have been studying for the last 10 years in our lab the effects of glyphosate, which again is this herbicide, pesticide that's ubiquitous in our environment. 4 billion pounds a year are poured into our soil and water systems. 4 billion pounds of this toxin are there, and what we're showing is at tiny, tiny concentrations, the first thing that happens to human cells is they start to break the connections between one another. And so cells develop isolation. In the gut lining, this means leak. And so, again, lose the context of nature, the vibrational support of the entire ecosystem of a gut, and you start to sterilize it. No more bacteria, no more fungi, no more protozoa. And the result is leaky gut. And so in this extraordinary way, we've been able to demonstrate that the loss of ecosystem leads to a failure of the vessel of the human being. They no longer are a coherent vessel that says there's outside, there's inside, here's me. I get to hold nutrients, I get to hold water, I get to hold life in this thing that I call a human body. That vessel is literally failing in its disconnect from the microbiome. And we've been able to show exactly how that happens now over the last years. We've been able to show that the small carbon molecules made by bacteria and fungi, when they consume nutrients in the soil or in your gut lining, they start churning out these carbon molecules that function as the wireless communication network between human cells and inside human cells. And so you can imagine your own cell phone being very similar to a cell within a human being. Your cell phone is connected to roughly, I think it's like 3.2, or no, it's much higher than that now. You're at about 5 billion cell phones worldwide or something now. You're connected to every other cell phone through a wireless communication network. In the same way, 70 trillion human cells are connected to one another through this wireless communication network. But if you go more than a kilometer from a 5G tower, you got nothing. You are now an isolated thing. You can't get grandma on the phone. Your text messages aren't updating. Your company is about to fire you because you missed 3 meetings. Like, you're that fragile. You're just a small loss of wireless communication network, and you've now become dysfunctional within the greater system. Same thing is happening at the human cell level. As soon as you lose the wireless communication network that's made by the ecosystem, made by bacteria and fungi, as soon as you lose that, cells no longer communicating, and they're not getting the updates as to what they need, what resources are available, what they should be producing, and they start to become dysfunctional. And in that isolation, they immediately start to take the journey into cancer. A cancer cell is the most isolated cell in the body. Every cell that goes into isolation is going to become a cancer cell, period. No way around it. And so, as we have been killing the microbiome with billions of pounds of herbicides and pesticides globally, we've been reducing the communication network, the wireless communication network of biology. So, life on Earth is becoming more and more isolated at the cellular level. Every bacteria, every human cell, all of them becoming more and more isolated as we put more and more herbicide pressure on the planet. And for this, we see the explosion of cancer and autoimmune disease and all that. But I find it just as interesting that when you go past that human experience of disease and start to think about biologic dis-ease on the planet is happening, and we call it climate crisis, or we call it global warming, all kinds of reductionist definitions of, well, CO2 is our enemy. There's no way CO2 is our enemy. CO2 is actually the fuel that makes biology happen. But we demonize these little reductionist things out there around us to try to explain why the system is failing. And it's exciting to me that all we need is the wireless network to go back up. Because the second you get within that kilometer zone of your 5G network, you're suddenly connected to everybody again, and everything updates immediately. Calendar's back on, all your text messages come in. Oh, I need to get over there. I need to send resources there. I need to get my bank account to do that. But it's instantaneous because the cell still has all its functions. It just in its isolation didn't know how to participate in the global thing. So what we're seeing in the regenerative movement is as soon as we go to support the ecosystem that supports the human vessel, you get to see this explosion of life happen. And this happens in an autistic child. When you get an autistic child truly re-supported by nature, at the cellular level, at the social level, at the economic level, as all of those layers build in around this being, they start talking and they start sharing their genius from their perspective. Because the beautiful thing about an autistic generation is they actually don't have the ego. They cannot be programmed in the same way because they've failed to believe that anything is separate. We have so destroyed the neurologic frameworks of separateness that our autistic community is literally showing us what a connected human mind looks like and what we might think of from a connected human mind, what kind of creativity we may be capable of tapping into when we become whole. And so I think we need the autistic journey we're on. I think that these autistic children of today will design the future that the rest of us cannot imagine, that still have this split egoic mind. They are not doing relationship anything like anything's been done, not to one another, not to their parents, not to their homes. They are just they're going to have to reinvent everything. And we saw some early, movers in this. Temple Grandin is an amazing example of a woman, coming early in that autism spectrum kind of rise of prevalence. She was early on in the 1970s and 80s. She became one of the first really high functioning autistic leaders that were able to show us that we needed to reinvent the cattle industry. And she started realizing that cattle were experiencing autistic traits or were displaying autistic traits. She had already figured it out in her own body that she radically reduced her stress levels if she was hugged. So she created a hugging machine in her own bedroom that squeezed on her body for a couple hours before bed every night. And it had this huge effect on her cognition, on her function, her stress levels, everything else. So she created hugging machines for cows in the 1980s and 90s. And so now pretty much, almost every feedlot that's out there now will have one of these units that the cow will move through the chute. And when it's time for them to get injected with antibiotics and all the junk that they're going to inject, whatever, they go in and these big flaps of used tires or old tires hug in on them. So these big rubber flaps move in on the sides of the cows to give them a giant hug, and their stress level reduces and all this. She created these winding paths through the feedlots so the cows weren't walking in a single file line, which she figured out was increasing their stress levels. So she took a $1 trillion industry with one woman saying this is not working. It can be done better, and she had the vision for doing that. So the autistic world will be a different world because she understood that she was no different than the cow at the experiential level. She was biology, the cow was biology, and both were experiencing a stressful environment, and she knew how to change that stress level. And so when we start building food systems that we understand that are connected to us, not just from a protein and carbohydrate delivery system, every carrot, every chicken, every cow, every pig is actually connected to us energetically, then we are automatically going to know that the worth of creating a lower stress food system. If you have a chicken that is in horror, in absolute terror, the moment it's born, and is isolated from nature completely, and is one of the few chickens still alive at 6 weeks when it's butchered for your chicken salad, you are eating the emotional genetic expression of impending doom. And the experience of impending doom is the exact sentence that is in the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for panic attack. Panic attack is now one of the number one complaints in teenagers and young women around the world. They're sitting there eating, they're driving, they're doing something completely benign, and then they're overwhelmed with this sense of impending doom. And suddenly they feel like the sky is falling, everybody's against them, nobody cares about them, and their heart's going 180 a minute. They think they're dying. It's because they just ate the genetic information of, I'm about to die, impending doom, nobody's ever cared for me, I don't even know who I am. They're literally eating that genetic information, and our laboratory has been able to witness those relationships, stressed soil, stressed plants into stressed human cells. That continuum is absolutely continuous. That continuum is absolutely predicting our future. If we do not start to reinvent a food system, we will go ahead and march ourselves into the most anxious death you can imagine.
Wow, you covered so much there. And I think I saw some article or study a while ago that showed that around slaughterhouses, there's a lot more domestic violence and certain types of crimes. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but that consciousness that it transfers. So yeah,
It's a
I
massive
totally.
transfer.
Is there any like hardcore scientific evidence that shows that if an animal suffered more, that would lead to more mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, they haven't done that at the population level, but you can show it at the individual level, which is almost scarier. You don't have to do a big population study to see this effect, but it's now understood that about 5% of the microRNA that are in the bloodstream of a human consumer. So you can measure the microRNA in the bloodstream. So when you feed somebody a meal of supreme pizza with sausage or whatever from the pig, within an hour, 5% of the microRNA in their bloodstream is from the pig. And those microRNA are not RNA that will create a protein. It's not actually a gene sequence designed to make a protein. The microRNA are actually the little switches or the communication network of the genome to dictate the behavior of all of the genes. And so that 5% of the stressed out pig in the bloodstream will then go and modify the genome of the individual that just ate the food. And so we've been able to show that, sequence in science. Okay, you eat stressed out messaging from the pig, and you can see those stress pathways turning on, pro-inflammatory, fight or flight, all these different pathways can then trigger in the human being. So all the way down to a single individual, or you can track these phenomena within the single individual. But it's something that just ticked off when you mentioned, like, within a circumference of a feedlot or one of these giant, abattoir meat processing centers, you can see the collapse of ethics, or you can see the collapse of morality. There's an incredible documentary on Smithfield that goes into this. Like, somehow these giant food processing systems have justified in their mind, and our economy of wanting cheap bacon has forced an economic devaluation of the humans that work in these spaces. No, there's no Americans that work in these plants. It's too dangerous. It's the most toxic environments. You can't find an American that wants to work in a meat processing plant. And so we are moving illegal, immigrants from the borders of our country directly to these meat processing centers, and they're being shipped by the companies have vans set up to keep moving people, and so 60, 80 new employees every week moving in, and then they develop a relationship to the government that's trying to bust, or the illegal immigration patterns, and so the government will show up every week, or maybe it's twice a month. I can't remember the rate that they're doing at Smithfield, but they'll show up and arrest 10 or 20, an agreed upon number, to demonstrate the success of the effort to curb illegal immigration, and the company ships in another 60, and without this, that it's justified to the U.S. government, I'm sure, by, if we don't do this, there will be no meat on the shelves. And so the government turns a blind eye to try to prevent starvation of their peoples in their country. And so I think lawmakers don't understand the problem. I don't think anybody's really seeing the forest for the trees probably here. So I'm not even saying that there's a single individual or a single group that's doing this malignant behavior, but this is what's resulted from our co-creation of an abstract economy of food. We are subsidizing, through human slave labor, cheap food, and we've been doing that forever. You can go back to the modern Egyptian histories 4,000, 5,000 years ago. We don't know ancient Egypt. Again, big block wall of amnesia of how the hell did they build those pyramids? Nobody knows. But that block that happened 5,000 years ago, when you read those records, there were slaves that were producing food in Egypt. And so North Africa was being run by slaves. And then the Roman Empire comes along, Greek Empire, Babylonian Empire. All these empires were running slave labor primarily to create food. And so we have been basing our food production and our increasing consumptive capacity as food eaters. We've been increasing that caloric capacity, or that caloric wealth, by increasing the scale of our social enslavement to these systems. And we're using slave labor every day in the United States for our food system, in fields, in meat plants, everywhere. And these people are being killed, on the job, by the toxicity and the danger of their jobs. There's no health care for them. They're illegal immigrants. So there's absolutely no safety net or care at some level. And so that's the end result of 5,000 years ago, us starting to enslave cattle, or the oxen, to plow our fields. You described that, or Schmachtenberger describes that so well. You fail to understand the sovereignty of an animal, you're soon going to fail to understand the sovereignty and value of a human being. And so we're 5,000 years into that journey, and we have devalued human life at such an extreme level. I just took a really intense trip through the border of Israel and Gaza, and it's the penultimate demonstration of our failure of our sense of value of humans. Human life is devalued to the level that we have been doing child sacrifice on a scale that is so grand you can't even fathom it, just in our wartime efforts. We radicalize our children against one another so that they think it's reasonable to go and create terror on another group of children. And so we are radicalizing children into warfare, and you know the dismal situations that are emerging in the media, as well as in Senate hearings and everything else, is the amount of child trafficking and sex trafficking. What we thought was the problem a few years ago, we were just the tip of the iceberg. And so the very worst of human behavior, the very deepest collapse of human value has occurred already. And we are now living in a society that is expressing this extreme devaluation of life, of one another, our children, the food they eat, the soils they live on, the planet that is our home. Deep, deep, deep crisis. And yet, in that hospice moment of humanity, again, it is just unbelievable, the light that is showing through so many people right now. The resilience, the forgiveness, the hope that is shining through this thin veil of biology that is dimming. And that's what I got to see in hospice. It is in these moments of biologic death that we actually get to see a soul emerge. And you get to see the most beautiful woman, behind the thin skin of a 96-year-old body that is giving up its organ systems, giving up its function, giving up breath. And the light that shines through her eyes in those moments, even if she's nonverbal, she's transmitting so much information to you. If I have any good human traits left in me at this point in my career, I think it was directly transmitted through the eyes of newborn children or elderly dying. Those souls that were so unveiled by the biology that they were adopting or releasing, those unveiled souls passed so much information and beauty on to me in my career and in my life. And I am so humbled to have been witness to so much beauty. And honestly, it's kind of what keeps me alive right now is just this sense of gratitude for the beauty that I've seen. And I don't, some days I just am so out of energy to try to help a humanity that seems so determined to destroy itself and its planet. And when I'm most worn out, as I actually have been in the last couple of weeks, it just takes a couple seconds of remembering the light that came through the eyes of these beings, and knowing that I'm part of that experience. I'm on an ascension path, and as the hope and beliefs of my abstract world collapse, as the biology within me dims, I have an opportunity for something greater than a human body to shine through to the people around me, and that changes the frequency of things. And so I think that this is, we will do our best work as human beings when our bodies are so decayed and so biologically disrupted that we cannot do much anymore. And so I'm fine with AI. I'm fine with whatever needs to take over our doingness, whatever needs to destroy our biology to the point where we can remember who we are and have that hospice resurrection happen. 10% of the patients that I admitted to hospice over the years had to be discharged because they suddenly got a whole new lease on life. They rediscovered something fundamental about the state of existence, and their diseases go away, or they just simply step into new bodies, and they're so healthy in the year they're discharged from hospice and they're back out and doing their things, running their households. I've seen just the most remarkable recoveries. And 10% is a pretty freaking big number. If 10% of people that are told you got a few weeks left to live go on to live years with new purpose, new sense of self, new sense of identity, that's a pretty good rate. And so if 10% of our 8 billion can walk this hospice journey now together and see enough light in one another's eyes as we die, that's a worthwhile journey. That's a journey well lived, and it's not a failure. And I don't think humanity is going to fail. I think humanity is going to rebirth, but we're going to do it at that last possible second. It'll be in our last few breaths where we have to completely give up the egoic abstract constructs that have created the reality that we've tried to live in to put us back in nature. And we'll find ourselves back in nature, and we will find a new way to express our genetics, a new way to express our intelligence, and ultimately a new way of expressing our curiosity and creativity.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I really appreciate you sharing. And if I can pass on some encouragement, the work you're doing is having a tremendous effect. And whenever I mention your name, I get big reactions. And I was at a mushroom convention this last weekend, and people were like, "Oh, you got a podcast now?" And I said, "Oh yeah, my next guest is Dr. Zach Bush," and I got big eyes. And people were like, "Oh my god, everybody has a podcast," so they were like, "He's my dream guest. If I could get him on my podcast." So yeah, the message you're sharing is tremendously important, and I can empathize. I know what it feels like to get burnt out, but encouragement is great to give and receive, and it's fuel. So you're encouraging millions of people, and I hope you're hearing some encouragement in
Hmm.
return, because yeah, we need you. Like, it sounds like you're going all over the world.
Yeah, and I am receiving those massive downloads of light from people every day, and it's interesting. We can reach this point where, um, as humanity, we're reaching a point where it's actually really hard to receive even the good stuff. Um, And so I think we're all at this desperate state of nearly running out of energy to keep on going, having a more and more difficult time receiving energy from the encouragement that we try to give one another. Uh, we can hear the words and we can even maybe sense the sentiments behind them, but to actually physically receive the vibration of hope or the vibration of trust in nature is incredibly challenging. And I don't, I thank you. I mean, I appreciate the words there, and I hear them. And I think if I was a more complete version of myself, I would have an immediate, rush of neurologic, function and spiritual, ignition. And it's a warning to us that because of our egoic split, we actually are very bad at receiving the full breadth and depth of what an encouragement should do for one another. And the place in which I'm finding a solution for that is again in natural systems. When I really start to hit the wall, I have to go lay down underneath a tree and look up through the branches at a blue sky. And there's something about that phenomenon. I've talked many times on podcasts about that, I think, but when you see nature, you're experiencing something completely coherent. So like a tuning fork in an orchestra, it can take your instrument back into tune just witnessing the coherence of an oak tree. The oak tree has never woken up insecure about its identity. It's never, questioned, its function yesterday as an oak tree. It never looks out in the forest and be like, wow, I'm like, there's 80% of these trees that are bigger than me. I don't even know why I'm here. It just doesn't, that doesn't occur in the frequency of an oak. And so to witness coherence is a tuning fork. But if you turn that around and make yourself vulnerable enough to let down your egoic shield long enough to be seen by that oak tree, then something magnificent happens. And that's what's gotten me here so far. Because what I have found in managing teams and peoples and all that, it's usually the people you love the most and think you're supporting their careers or their trajectory and you're paying their salaries and everything's working, and it tends to be those that we hold most dear that end up hurting each other the most severely. And so there's this dangerous reality of being a split human, egoic human, that you are a blunt weapon to all those that are closest to you, and that's just a tragedy. But I think we can heal it if we allow ourselves to be seen by nature and we start to be encouraged directly from nature rather than through another egoic split mind. And suddenly the vibration is pure. And so we've seen this recently when I was in South Africa in this incredibly vulnerable population. There's about 2,000 homes in this one tiny little sector of this region, and the vast majority of them are severely battered women. They've escaped this neighborhood in an effort to get away from the wounded masculine that's doing so much harm. Domestic violence, 85-90% of households in these areas, gender violence, child violence, all of this. And so these women are escaping alone or with their children into this community that's largely single mothers. And it was here that we started this tent tree program. So many tears would come out of me if I just shared all the stories we just heard. It's only been running for 10 months and already 10% of the homes are under a tent tree program. Is just happening so fast now. Like it's just truly going viral house to house of like the excitement of what this could do for the community. And one of the women though comes to mind and it resonated when you said earlier that, when we started enslaving our animals, we started seeing them just as pieces of meat or as labor, not as sentient beings. And the opposite happened for this woman. She got up to tell her testimony, and she was speaking a local dialect, and it was translated to English. And the translation came through, and she was beaming, giving this testimony, just like lighthouse of a being. And as the story got reiterated to, it was just dumbfounding the amount of brightness she was shining, because she was basically giving a brief history of how downtrodden and destroyed she had been. Couldn't look anybody in the eye. Had gone through years of complete hopelessness, suicidality. Caring for her 4 children was the only thing keeping her alive. And then she got these 10 trees, and going into direct relationship with these 10 trees She suddenly experienced a new reality, and she said to us, for the first time, I'm no longer seeing trees as firewood and animals as food. I'm starting to realize that every animal is a friend of mine, and every tree is part of my is a partner to me, or something like this. And so she's totally reoriented her whole identity as a human being because of going into direct relationship with these 10 trees. And they're like this tall, they're like little saplings, and they've already healed her. There's no amount of psychotherapy we could have done to in just a few months, taking this woman from abject hopelessness to a state of empowerment. Her last sentence after saying that trees were no longer firewood and animals were no longer food or meat, she said, I had no idea that every one of us are leaders. That's a level of sovereignty that I don't know any psychotherapy regimen that can get somebody from abject poverty to full blown sovereignty and being their own leader in that short amount of time. But trees can do it. And so this is my encouragement to all of us is certainly we should continue to try to see each other's beauty. What's actually happening there because of the egoic split is we're seeing our own beauty reflected in the person next to us. So if that's the best we can do, we should keep doing that. But we could just bunny hop the whole egoic model if we allow ourselves to be observed by nature. So this is my invitation to all of you to get the heck out of your house or things, and hopefully you're listening to this podcast while you're running on a trail somewhere. But stop running, stop moving, lay down beneath a tree and be witness. Show it all of it. Show it all of your trauma. Show it all of your fear. Show it all of your hopelessness. Let that tree just see the horror that sits within you. The darkness within you wants to be seen, and no human can see it for the split mindedness of all of us. That tree can see your darkness, and it will transmute that into something much different. And so begin to create your new life through a direct relationship to nature. Be seen by that nature as much as you see that nature, and we will quickly emerge from the morass of our current human existence.
That's amazing. So, yeah, there is something really powerful about trees. And when I've had some psychedelic journeys, trees have had a profound impact on me. I've gotten some messages from them that really humbled me and also encouraged me. Uh, I hear a deep spiritual tone to everything that you say, and you definitely connect with a lot of spiritual people I talk to, which is rare from a medical doctor. You know, those fields are seem to be kind of far apart, but you have bridged that. Um,
Hospice bridged that for me. And so when you're admitting 80 patients a week to die, you're literally seeing spirit every day. Like, you're seeing biology fail and spirit come through. And these bodies will die and then come back and tell you the craziest things that are so unimaginable about the constructs of reality we live in. They'll tell you about the cosmos. They'll tell you about the way in which they just travel through the cosmos, and there are a few seconds of disconnect from the body. They'll tell you which beings they encountered, ancestors, angels, whatever it is. Like that, it's just unbelievable amount of spirit comes through that industry. So that's really where I got the bridge, back to my own spirit was seeing it through death. And um, when you stop seeing death as an endpoint and understand it as a rebirth process, and you lose that fear of death, life is a lot easier to live. There's a lot more abundance within the experience of every breath.
I love that. That's I think that's a beautiful way to end. What do you think?
That feels good to me, my friend.
Yeah,
Let's experience the abundance of every breath.
I'm
Let's let
really
go of
grateful
fear
for
of death
you.
and let's live a little bit more rich.
Absolutely. I'm super grateful for you. And I'm sure we'll do another animation anytime you
Awesome,
want to do
awesome.
one. Because,
Awesome, Mark. You're an inspiration to the world with those. I marvel at your talent that pulls that stuff through. So
oh,
it would be honored to work with you anytime on that.
oh, the honor is all mine. And I'm really grateful for what you said, too. That was a great compliment.
No, you do fantastic things for the world. Keep sending those resonance frequencies out.
Thank you. I'm going to go outside and sit under a tree now.
It's time.
Yeah.